Morgan Freeman drove slowly along the narrow road covered in fallen leaves, the dim glow of the streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement after the afternoon rain. His stomach grumbled, reminding him that his last meal had been nothing more than a hastily eaten sandwich that morning. As his eyes scanned the small storefronts lining the street, they settled on the sign for Maple Creek Diner, where the flickering red, open sign in the window cast a soft glow on the puddles below. The place looked warm and inviting, the kind of small-town diner that promised comfort and a good meal. He pulled into an empty parking spot near the entrance, turned off the engine, and took a deep breath before stepping out of the car. As he pushed open the door, a small bell chimed, signaling the arrival of a new customer. The rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee, mixed with the buttery scent of something sizzling on the griddle, instantly putting him at ease. The diner had a classic, homey feel. Wooden tables covered with red and white checkered tablecloths, framed black and white photos of the town's history on the walls, and a small counter with a few swiveling stools occupied by locals nursing cups of coffee. A country song played softly from an old radio perched on a shelf in the corner, its melody nostalgic and soothing. Morgan took in the scene, his gaze settling on the counter where a young waitress with curly brown hair tied back in a worn scrunchie was skillfully balancing 3 plates of food as she moved between tables. She turned toward him and smiled warmly. "Welcome to Maple Creek Diner. You can sit anywhere you'd like," she said, her voice friendly, carrying a slight southern lilt that added to the charm of the place. Morgan nodded in acknowledgement and made his way to a small booth by the window where he could watch the rain droplets still clinging to the glass, distorting the glow of the streetlights outside. He picked up the laminated menu, flipping through its selection of hearty, familiar dishes written in neat, no-nonsense lettering. His eyes lingered on one item: meatloaf with mashed potatoes. "Tonight's special." A faint smile touched his lips as it brought back memories of childhood dinners, of evenings spent in his grandmother's kitchen with the comforting scent of slow-cooked meals filling the air. The exhaustion from his long day seemed to lessen as he imagined the taste of a warm, home-cooked meal and a strong cup of coffee. The waitress returned, setting down a glass of water before pulling out a small notepad. "Would you like to start with some coffee?" she asked. Morgan met her gaze and nodded. "That sounds like a perfect idea." She smiled again before turning toward the coffee pot, leaving him alone with his thoughts. As he exhaled, relaxing into the worn vinyl seat, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The gentle hum of conversation, the clinking of silverware, and the smell of freshly baked bread made the world outside feel far away. He had no idea, however, that in just a few moments, this quiet dinner he had been looking forward to would take an unexpected turn. As Morgan Freeman sat comfortably in the booth, scanning the menu, the sound of sizzling from the kitchen and the faint hum of conversation in the diner created an atmosphere of quiet contentment. The waitress, Talia, moved behind the counter to fetch the coffee pot, her movements practiced and efficient. Just as she reached for a mug, a woman emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. Melissa, the owner of Maple Creek Diner, had been in the back preparing fresh dough for tomorrow's batch of biscuits, unaware of the newest guest who had just walked in. The moment her eyes landed on Morgan Freeman, however, her entire demeanor changed. Her hands froze mid-motion, the color in her face shifting as recognition dawned on her. A deep furrow formed between her brows, and her jaw tightened, her breath catching slightly as she processed what she was seeing. It wasn't every day that a world-famous actor walked into her small-town diner, and for a brief moment she stood there stunned before quickly calling out in a sharp voice, "Talia, come here a second." Talia, confused by the sudden urgency in her boss's tone, placed the coffee pot back on the warmer and walked over. The two women stood near the register, their voices hushed as Melissa leaned in closer. "That's Morgan Freeman," she said in a clipped tone, her expression unreadable. Talia blinked, glancing back at the booth where the distinguished man sat, seemingly unaware of the growing tension. "Yeah, I know," Talia whispered back. "I was just about to bring him coffee." Melissa shook her head, her expression hardening. "No, we're not serving him," she said flatly. Talia's eyes widened, unable to mask her shock. "What? Why?" she asked, struggling to understand what had just shifted in the past few seconds. Melissa exhaled sharply, crossing her arms over her chest as she spoke in a firm yet hushed voice. I don't want this place turning into some tourist trap. I run a diner, not a celebrity photo booth. The second people see him here, we'll have the press, fans, social media blowing up the place. I can't afford that kind of attention. This is my business, and I decide who eats here." Talia swallowed, glancing over at Morgan Freeman, who was now idly tapping his fingers on the table, waiting patiently. Her stomach twisted with unease. The air in the diner, once light and warm, now felt heavy with unspoken tension. The other customers had started to take notice of Melissa's abrupt shift in mood, their conversations dying down to murmurs. A few heads subtly turned toward Morgan's booth, as if sensing that something unusual was happening. Talia hesitated, lowering her voice. "Melissa, he's just here for dinner. He hasn't asked for special treatment. He hasn't even taken his phone out." But Melissa had already made up her mind. Straightening her apron, she took a deep breath and walked toward Morgan Freeman's booth with purposeful steps, Talia following hesitantly behind her. Morgan looked up as Melissa approached, offering her a polite, warm smile, but Melissa's expression remained firm, her arms still crossed over her chest. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice steady but unyielding, "but I can't serve you here." The words hung in the air for a moment, as if they had sucked all the warmth out of the room. The diner, once filled with the comforting sounds of cutlery against plates and soft music playing from the radio, fell into an eerie silence. Morgan's brow lifted slightly, confusion flickering across his face. "I'm sorry?" he asked, his voice even and calm, though there was a slight furrow in his expression as he tried to understand. Melissa squared her shoulders, refusing to waver. "I know who you are, Mr. Freeman, and I don't want the attention that comes with serving someone like you. This is a small town, and I run a quiet business. I get to decide who eats here, and I don't feel comfortable having you in my restaurant." For the first time, the clatter of a spoon being set down too loudly on a saucer echoed through the room. A man at the counter who had been stirring his coffee absent-mindedly placed his cup down with an audible clink. Talia shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Morgan and Melissa, her grip tightening around her notepad. She wished she could disappear. Morgan, meanwhile, remained composed, studying Melissa's face with quiet thoughtfulness. His first instinct might have been to argue, to remind her that refusing service to someone based on who they were wasn't exactly fair, or even good business. But instead he simply exhaled, then nodded slowly, as if carefully choosing his next words. "I understand," he said at last, his voice calm, almost gentle. He carefully folded the menu and placed it back into its holder before sliding out of the booth with measured movements. "It's your business, your choice." Melissa seemed momentarily taken aback by his lack of protest, as if she had braced herself for an argument that never came. "Thank you for your honesty," he added, offering her a small nod before turning toward the door. The weight of 100 gazes followed him as he made his way across the silent diner. Talia felt her heart pounding, her palms damp against the notepad still clutched in her hands. As Morgan reached for the door handle, the bell above the door jingled once more, breaking the suffocating silence. A cool evening breeze rushed into the room as he stepped outside, disappearing into the night. Inside, the tension did not fade immediately. The customers sat frozen in awkward silence, casting uncertain glances toward Melissa, who stood rigidly in place. Some nodded in agreement, others exchanged uncomfortable looks. Talia could barely breathe as she looked at her boss, unable to shake the image of Morgan Freeman's face when he left. Not angry, not outraged, just... The moment Morgan Freeman stepped out of the diner, the bell above the door jingling softly as the door swung shut behind him, a thick, suffocating silence settled over the room. The hum of conversation that had filled the air just minutes ago had completely vanished, replaced by an awkward stillness. Customers sat frozen in place, their utensils hovering above their plates, eyes darting between Melissa, who still stood rigidly near the booth Morgan had just vacated, and the now empty doorway. The tension was palpable, an invisible weight pressing down on the small space. At the counter, a man in a work uniform cleared his throat and set his coffee cup down with a little more force than necessary, the sharp clink of ceramic against the countertop breaking the quiet. A woman at the table near the window exchanged a look with her husband, her brows knitted in disbelief, before shaking her head slightly and returning to her meal, though it was clear she was no longer enjoying it. Behind the counter, Talia still stood frozen, her fingers gripping the edge of her notepad so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her stomach twisted with unease, a strange, sinking feeling creeping through her chest. She had been working at Maple Creek Diner long enough to know that Melissa was headstrong, but never had she seen her turn someone away so directly, so coldly, and not just anyone. Morgan Freeman, a man she had grown up watching in movies, a man whose deep, resonant voice had narrated countless stories that had shaped generations. He had been nothing but polite, yet he had been dismissed as if he were an inconvenience. Talia's heart pounded as she glanced at the other employees. Hector, the cook, had poked his head out from the kitchen window, his expression unreadable. Danya, the other waitress on shift, was pretending to focus on refilling the ketchup bottles, but her hands were trembling slightly. No one knew what to say. Finally, a voice broke the silence. "Did that just happen?" It came from an older man near the back, his voice laced with disbelief. "She just kicked out Morgan Freeman?" Another customer, a middle-aged woman with short blonde hair, let out a breath, shaking her head. "He wasn't even causing trouble," she muttered. "Why would you do that?" Her words weren't directed at anyone in particular, but they hung in the air like a challenge. Melissa, still standing stiffly, squared her shoulders, her jaw tight. "It's my business," she said simply, though there was a slight edge to her voice now, as if she were preparing to defend herself. "I have the right to decide who I serve." Some of the customers nodded slightly, whether in agreement or just in quiet acceptance, but others exchanged uncomfortable glances, their meals suddenly less appetizing. Talia swallowed hard. She wanted to say something, to challenge Melissa's decision, to speak up for the man who had just walked out into the night without protest. But what could she say? This was her job, and she needed it. Yet, as she wiped her damp palms on her apron and looked at the untouched cup of coffee she had been about to serve, she couldn't shake the image of Morgan Freeman's face, calm, composed, but undeniably disappointed. The weight of that look settled heavily on her chest, and deep down, she knew that things at Maple Creek Diner had just changed in a way that no one had anticipated. Morgan Freeman stood still for a brief moment after Melissa's words settled in the air, the silence in the diner wrapping around him like a heavy shroud. His expression remained calm, composed, but there was an undeniable flicker of something else in his eyes. Perhaps disappointment, perhaps quiet understanding. He slowly exhaled, then gave a small nod, as if acknowledging the reality of the situation rather than fighting against it. With measured movements, he carefully folded the menu and placed it back in its holder, his fingers lingering on the edges for just a second before he slid out of the booth. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, as if he were giving everyone in the diner a chance to absorb what had just happened. As he stood up, the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes settled on him, the room still heavy with an awkward, tense quiet. Every sound, the scraping of his shoe against the tiled floor, the rustling of his coat as he adjusted it, felt amplified in the absence of the usual diner chatter. No one spoke, no one moved. Morgan turned his gaze to Melissa for a final moment, his deep, warm voice carrying none of the sharpness or resentment that some might have expected. "Thank you for your honesty," he said simply, offering a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning toward the door. The words seemed to hang in the air, neither accusatory nor forgiving, just an acknowledgement of what had transpired. His steps toward the exit were slow but steady, his posture upright, dignified, betraying no hint of anger. He wasn't leaving in a storm of frustration, wasn't making a spectacle of himself, yet the weight of his departure was felt by every single person in that room. Talia, still gripping the notepad in her hand, felt a tight knot in her chest as she watched him go. A few of the customers exchanged glances, their forks frozen mid-air, unsure of how to react. A man at the counter cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Even those who agreed with Melissa's decision couldn't ignore the uneasy atmosphere that now clung to the diner. The small bell above the door jingled as Morgan pushed it open, the cool evening air rushing in as he stepped outside. He paused briefly, glancing up at the neon open sign that buzzed faintly in the window, casting a dull red glow onto the pavement below. For a fleeting second, his reflection shimmered in the glass before disappearing into the darkening street beyond. Back inside, the tension did not immediately lift. Melissa stood motionless, her arms still crossed, her face unreadable, though something in her eyes suggested she had not expected him to leave quite so quietly. The customer slowly resumed eating, though the once lively atmosphere had dimmed, replaced by a strange, lingering discomfort. Talia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, staring at the now empty booth where Morgan Freeman had sat just moments ago. She couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened, something that none of them would fully understand until much later. Sitting in his car outside Maple Creek Diner, Morgan Freeman stared at the neon glow of the sign reflecting on his windshield, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. His stomach still ached with hunger, but there was something heavier pressing on his chest, a quiet weight that had nothing to do with food. He had faced rejection before in his life, in ways big and small, but this moment felt different, not because of its intensity, but because of what it represented. He could have reacted with frustration, could have made a statement condemning the diner, could have used his influence to direct outrage toward the small-town establishment, but that wasn't who he was. Instead, he reached for his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen for a moment before he started typing. Stopped by a little place tonight in Oakwood called Maple Creek Diner. It smelled incredible, real home cooking, the kind that reminds you of family dinners and slow Sunday mornings. But I didn't get the chance to try anything. The owner didn't want me there, said she was uncomfortable serving someone like me, and that's okay. It's her business, her right. But here's what I saw. I saw a warm, inviting diner full of people enjoying their meals. I saw a young waitress who works hard and treats every customer with kindness. I saw a town that takes pride in its small businesses, in places like this that have been around for years, feeding families, serving coffee to early risers, and giving people a place to gather. And that's something worth supporting. If you're ever in Oakwood, stop by Maple Creek Diner. Order the meatloaf special. Smelled amazing. Try it for me. He reread the words, ensuring they reflected exactly what he wanted to say. No bitterness, no anger, just truth. He wasn't interested in stirring division or fueling outrage. If anything, he wanted to highlight what he had seen beyond that single moment of rejection. He hesitated briefly before pressing post, knowing that once it was out there, it was no longer just his story. It belonged to the world. Within minutes, notifications began to flood in. The initial wave of comments came from fans, many expressing shock and disappointment. Morgan Freeman got turned away from a diner? Who would do that? Others were angry, calling for boycotts, demanding apologies. This is unacceptable. That diner should be ashamed. But then, as the post gained traction, something unexpected happened. People started focusing not just on the rejection, but on the message behind his words. They latched onto his praise for the diner itself, the food, the community. Comments began shifting. I was ready to be mad, but honestly, now I just really want to try that meatloaf. Someone else chimed in, respect to Mr. Freeman for taking the high road. That's class. The post spread rapidly across platforms, shared by celebrities, journalists, and everyday people alike. News outlets picked it up, framing it as a rare example of grace in a time when online outrage was the norm. Some debated the ethics of the diner's decision, while others praised Morgan Freeman's response as a lesson in dignity. Meanwhile, in Oakwood, as the quiet town slept, its small diner was unknowingly becoming famous, not for who it had turned away, but for the unexpected kindness that followed. As soon as Morgan Freeman's post began circulating, the internet erupted with reactions from every corner. Celebrities, journalists, and everyday social media users weighed in, each interpreting the situation in their own way. Prominent actors and filmmakers who had worked with Freeman before quickly shared his post, with many expressing their admiration for his graceful response. Class act, as always, one well-known director tweeted, attaching a screenshot of Freeman's words. Others, including fellow actors, added their thoughts, with some simply commenting, unbelievable, or who turns away Morgan Freeman, adding a mix of shock and support. Late-night talk show hosts wasted no time turning the story into a topic of discussion, with some using it as a humorous jab. Breaking news! Local diner turns away one of the most beloved voices in America. Stay tuned to see if they also reject Santa Claus and Tom Hanks. But beyond the jokes, there was a real conversation unfolding, especially in the news media. Major outlets ran headlines ranging from "Morgan Freeman denied service at small-town diner, but his response will surprise you," to "A lesson in grace, how one man turned rejection into kindness." Some news segments focused on the diner's right to refuse service, analyzing whether it was fair or justified, while others honed in on the broader message of Freeman's post, how one could choose to respond to rejection with dignity instead of outrage. Public sentiment was divided. While many rallied behind Freeman, commending his refusal to incite negativity, others expressed frustration on his behalf, demanding accountability from the diner. Meanwhile, within hours, Google searches for Maple Creek Diner spiked, and on travel sites, people began leaving comments, not in protest but with curiosity. "That meatloaf better be as good as he says," one person joked. While Melissa had feared unwanted attention, she never could have predicted this. Her diner was about to become the most talked-about restaurant in America. The morning after Morgan Freeman's post went viral, Maple Creek Diner woke up to an entirely different reality. What had once been a quiet, small-town eatery where locals gathered for their usual coffee and breakfast had, overnight, become the center of national attention. At first, Melissa had no idea what was happening. She arrived at the diner at her usual time, expecting the same familiar morning routine, brewing fresh coffee, prepping the griddle for pancakes, and setting out silverware on the wooden tables. But the moment she pulled into the parking lot, she knew something was off. There were already cars lined up along the street, people standing outside in small groups, waiting. Some held their phones up, taking pictures of the diner's blue awning and classic neon "Open" sign. Others were flipping through the online menu on their screens, chatting excitedly about what they were going to order. Melissa hesitated for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, before finally stepping out. The moment she unlocked the front door, a flood of customers rushed in, filling every available seat in minutes. Inside, Talia and the other waitstaff were already overwhelmed, moving frantically between tables. The counter stools, which were usually occupied by the same handful of regulars, were now taken by visitors who had driven in from nearby towns, eager to see the place that had turned into an internet sensation. The sound of conversation filled the air, people whispering about Morgan Freeman's post, speculating on why he had been turned away, and most importantly, debating whether the meatloaf special was as good as he had suggested. The cash register chimed constantly as order after order was placed, the kitchen working at full capacity. Hector, the cook, wiped sweat from his forehead as he flipped pancakes and scrambled eggs at a speed he had never needed to before. "We're going to run out of ingredients at this rate," he muttered, glancing at the growing line of tickets hanging above the grill. By midday, the small diner was completely packed, and the wait time had stretched beyond an hour. Customers stood outside leaning against their cars, sipping coffee from paper cups they had picked up at the gas station down the street. A news van pulled up, and within moments a local reporter stepped out, adjusting her microphone. "This is unreal," Danny, another waitress, whispered to Talia as they both watched from the window. The reporter, Camden Walsh from Channel 8 News, had covered small-town stories before, but never had he seen something like this. "We'd like a quick interview about the viral moment that has everyone talking," he called through the glass. But Melissa, standing behind the register, shook her head firmly. "No press," she said under her breath, then turned back to the growing crowd of hungry patrons. Despite the chaos, the mood inside was electric. Customers excitedly snapped photos of their plates, tagging the diner on social media with captions like, "Trying Morgan Freeman's almost dinner. Let's see if the meatloaf lives up to the hype." Others recorded videos showing off their steaming plates of food, laughing as they recounted the reason they had traveled all this way. The hashtag Morgan Freeman Diner started trending on Twitter, fueling the fire even more. But while many people were simply caught up in the excitement of visiting a suddenly famous restaurant, others weren't as amused. Some of the town's longtime customers, those who had been coming to Maple Creek Diner for years, sat in silence, their usual booths occupied by strangers. One older man, who had eaten breakfast at the same counter stool every morning for a decade, shook his head as he sipped his coffee. "This used to be our place," he murmured. "Now it feels like a tourist trap." Melissa felt the weight of it all pressing down on her shoulders. She had worried about attention, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. She had refused to serve Morgan Freeman because she feared what his presence might bring, but in an ironic twist, his absence had turned her diner into the most sought-after restaurant in the region. As the hours passed and orders kept piling in, she leaned against the counter for just a moment, rubbing her temples. The question lingered in her mind, one she wasn't ready to answer yet. Was this a blessing or a disaster? Melissa stood behind the counter, gripping the edge of the cash register as she watched another wave of customers flood into Maple Creek Diner. The doorbell jingled almost constantly, a sound that had once been comforting but now felt overwhelming. The small-town diner she had spent years running, carefully maintaining its quiet charm and local feel, was suddenly unrecognizable. Strangers occupied nearly every seat, their faces lit up by phone screens as they snapped photos of their meals, tagging the diner in posts she had never asked for. The kitchen was in chaos, her staff barely keeping up, and even Hector, who prided himself on never being rattled, looked exhausted behind the grill. This wasn't supposed to happen. Melissa had refused to serve Morgan Freeman because she didn't want her restaurant to become a spectacle, a place where people came not for the food or the warmth of the community, but because of a headline, a viral moment. And yet, despite her efforts, that was exactly what had happened. Her fingers trembled slightly as she punched in another order, barely hearing the customer in front of her as they cheerfully asked how long the wait would be. An hour? Maybe more. People didn't seem to mind. If anything, the long wait only added to the experience, making them feel like they were part of something special. But for Melissa, there was nothing special about it, only exhaustion, only a gnawing feeling in her stomach that she had lost control of something she had worked so hard to build. She glanced toward the window and saw a group of reporters standing outside, their cameras angled toward the diner. They hadn't come inside yet, but she knew it was only a matter of time. She had already refused multiple phone calls from journalists asking for a statement, but they weren't going to let this go. The world had decided that Maple Creek Diner was a story, and she was at the center of it, whether she liked it or not. She turned toward Talia, who was rushing past with a tray of coffee cups balanced on one hand. "This is insane," Melissa muttered under her breath, shaking her head. Talia barely had time to respond, only throwing her boss a quick, knowing look before moving to the next table. The young waitress looked just as overwhelmed as Melissa felt. The regular customers, those who had been coming to the diner for years, looked uncomfortable, their usual routines disrupted by the surge of new visitors. The elderly couple who always sat by the window in the mornings had left early today, unable to enjoy their breakfast with the noise and cameras flashing outside. That was what hurt Melissa the most. She had built this place for them, for the locals who had supported her through the hardest years of her life, not for social media influencers looking for their next viral post. A deep sigh escaped her lips as she wiped her hands on her apron, forcing herself to focus. The diner was still hers, wasn't it? This was still her business. But for the first time since she had opened its doors, it didn't feel like home. It felt like a stage, and she was no longer the one calling the shots. Talia had never seen the diner like this before. Every table was filled, every counter stool occupied, and the line at the door didn't seem to shrink no matter how fast they turned over orders. The air buzzed with energy, conversations overlapping, the clatter of silverware against plates, the sizzling from the kitchen non-stop. At first she had been excited, swept up in the thrill of the unexpected rush, but as the hours stretched on, that excitement quickly turned into exhaustion. Her feet ached from weaving between tables, her arms sore from carrying trays stacked with plates of pancakes, burgers, and of course the now infamous meatloaf special. She barely had a moment to catch her breath before another order came in, another table waved her down, another cup of coffee needed a refill. It wasn't just the sheer number of customers that was overwhelming, it was who they were. Strangers from out of town, influencers holding their phones up to film their meals, reporters jotting down notes as they observed the madness unfolding around them. Talia could feel the tension in the air, not just from herself, but from her coworkers too. Danny, the other waitress, had started the day smiling, eager for tips from the increased traffic, but by mid-morning, her patience was thinning, her polite smiles forced. Hector, working the grill, was moving at an almost inhuman pace, flipping burgers and plating meals with an urgency that made it clear he was running on pure adrenaline. "We're running low on everything," he grumbled as Talia passed by the kitchen window, barely looking up as he slid another plate onto the counter. "If this keeps up, we'll be out of food before lunch." Normally, such a statement would have seemed ridiculous, but today, it felt entirely possible. The regulars, those who had been coming to the diner for years, were sitting quietly at their usual spots, watching the spectacle unfold with mixed expressions. Some were amused, others irritated, but most seemed unsure of what to make of it. Talia caught sight of one of the older customers, a man who had eaten breakfast at the same counter stool for over a decade, frowning as he stirred his coffee, his space now surrounded by people he had never seen before. That image unsettled her more than the flashing cameras outside. She had always loved the warmth of Maple Creek Diner, the way it felt like home not just to her but to the entire town. Now, it felt like something else entirely. A tourist attraction, a social media trend, a place that wasn't theirs anymore. As she wiped her hands on her apron, she couldn't help but wonder, was this what Melissa had feared? Was this what they had all unknowingly invited into their lives? Melissa sat alone in her office at the back of Maple Creek Diner, the hum of conversation from the packed dining room barely reaching her through the closed door. In her hands, she held an envelope, cream-colored, heavier than usual mail, with her name neatly written in strong, slanted handwriting. She had known this letter was coming the moment she saw the name on the return address. Morgan Freeman. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper, her heart pounding, though she wasn't entirely sure why. She had expected outrage, a demand for an apology, maybe even legal threats. But as she read the first lines, she realized just how wrong she had been. "Dear Ms. Hargrove, first, I want to thank you for your honesty. In a world where people often hide their true feelings, your directness was, in its own way, refreshing. I don't hold any resentment toward you for your decision that evening. It is your business, and you have the right to decide who you serve. But I wanted to share with you something my grandmother taught me a long time ago. That the way we respond to rejection defines us more than the rejection itself. When I left your diner, I could have been angry. I could have made a different kind of post, one that called for outrage rather than curiosity. But I chose not to, because I saw something beyond that moment. I saw a diner that has served this community for years, a place that, despite everything, deserves to be recognized for what it brings to the town. That's why I encouraged people to visit, not out of spite but out of respect for what your establishment represents. But that night I also discovered something I didn't expect. My waitress, Talia, mentioned that her grandmother, Eliza Reynolds, believes she was childhood friends with my own grandmother, Beverly Freeman. She has photographs, memories, pieces of my family's history that I never knew existed. That, to me, is remarkable. It reminds me that we are all connected in ways we don't always realize, that our pasts shape us more than we know, and that sometimes fate brings us to unexpected places for a reason. I would like to meet with you. Not for the press, not for any publicity, but simply as two people sitting down for a meal together. I would also love to meet Eliza, to hear her stories, to learn about the woman who helped shape my grandmother's life. I don't ask you to change your mind about me, nor do I expect anything beyond a conversation. But if you are willing, I would be honored to accept a meal at your diner, the one I was turned away from. If you would have me, I would like to sit at your table, share a meal, and talk, just as neighbors do. Sincerely, Morgan Freeman. Melissa read the letter once, then again, slower this time, letting each word settle in her mind. It wasn't what she had expected. There was no anger, no accusation, just understanding, just kindness. She let out a slow breath, staring at the paper in front of her, her fingers smoothing out the slight crease she had made while unfolding it. She had spent the past week trying to push down the nagging feeling in her chest, the quiet voice telling her that she had made a mistake. She had told herself that turning Morgan Freeman away had been about protecting her business, about keeping the diner from turning into something she didn't want it to be. But now, reading his words, she saw it differently. Had she been protecting the diner, or had she been protecting herself? The mention of Eliza made her chest tighten even more. She had always respected the older woman, had known she was a strong, kind person. If Eliza had a connection to Morgan Freeman's family, what did that say about him? Could it be possible that she had judged him too quickly, had assumed things about him based on nothing more than her own fears? She set the letter down, rubbing her temples. This wasn't just about a meal anymore. It was about something bigger, about admitting that she might have been wrong, about offering a chance at understanding rather than division. For the first time since that night, Melissa didn't feel defensive. She felt something else, something quieter, something unfamiliar. She felt the weight of a decision she knew she had to make. Melissa stood behind the counter, the letter still clutched in her hand, her fingers tracing the edges as if the texture of the paper might somehow provide answers she couldn't find herself. The diner had just closed for the evening, and the last of the customers had filtered out, leaving only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clatter of dishes being stacked in the back. She had gathered her staff, Talia, Donnie, Hector, and the others, around the center tables, the same place where they had sat for their last meeting, the one interrupted by a burst pipe. But tonight, the tension in the air was different. She took a deep breath, glancing down at the words Morgan Freeman had written before looking up at the expectant faces of her employees. "I got a letter," she began, her voice measured but uncertain. "From him." She didn't need to say his name, they all knew. Talia, standing with her arms crossed, shifted slightly, as if bracing herself. Hector wiped his hands on his apron and leaned against the counter, waiting. Danny, always the most outspoken, raised an eyebrow. "And?" she prompted. Melissa hesitated, then unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning it once more before she spoke. "He's not angry," she admitted, almost as if it surprised her to say it out loud. "He's not calling for a boycott, not demanding anything. He actually thanked me for my honesty." There was a murmur among the staff, an exchange of glances. That was unexpected. "He said he doesn't hold anything against me," she continued, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "But he wants to meet, not for the cameras, not for the press, just to have a meal, to talk. And he also," she hesitated before looking at Talia, "he mentioned Eliza." Talia's breath caught. "My grandmother?" she asked, her voice softer than before. Melissa nodded. "He says she and his grandmother were childhood friends, that she might have stories about his family that he's never heard before." At that, the energy in the room changed. Talia's face, which had been guarded, softened with something like realization. Hector rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Even Danny, who had been skeptical at first, looked intrigued. "So, what are you going to do?" Danny finally asked. Melissa exhaled slowly, glancing down at the letter. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "I didn't want this attention, and I still don't, but—" She ran a hand over her face, clearly exhausted from the weight of it all. "I think I might have been wrong about him, or at least about what this would turn into." Talia took a step forward, her voice measured but firm. "Melissa, I get why you were hesitant. I do. But this isn't just about business anymore. This is about people, about stories that connect us in ways we don't even realize." She hesitated, then added, "And maybe it's about doing the right thing." Melissa let those words settle, feeling the weight of them. The idea of sitting across from Morgan Freeman, of admitting, maybe not directly, but in some way, that she had misjudged him, felt daunting. But Talia was right. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something bigger. She looked around at her staff, taking in their expectant expressions. Then, with a slow, careful nod, she made her decision. "All right," she said. "I'll invite him back." Eliza sat alone at the counter of Maple Creek Diner long after the staff had gone home, the hum of the kitchen's cooling fans the only sound filling the empty space. In front of her lay the letter from Morgan Freeman, unfolded and slightly creased from how many times she had read it. Her fingers traced the edges of the paper absent-mindedly as she let her mind wrestle with the decision that had been weighing on her all day. Inviting him back, it should have been a simple decision, but for her it wasn't. It was more than just about making amends. It was about confronting a choice she had made in the heat of the moment, a decision that had now placed her diner at the center of something much bigger than she had ever intended. She thought about what had driven her to turn him away that night. Fear, maybe. Fear that her diner would become something she couldn't control, that she would lose the sense of home she had built here. But had she been protecting the business, or had she just been protecting herself from confronting her own biases and assumptions? She had been so sure that rejecting him had been the right call until it wasn't, until the world responded in a way she hadn't expected. Until Morgan Freeman himself responded in a way that had challenged everything she thought she knew about how people handled rejection. The thought of sitting across from him, admitting in her own way that she had misjudged him, still made her uneasy. But then she thought about Eliza, about the connection this dinner could bring, not just between her and Morgan Freeman, but between two families that had unknowingly been tied together for generations. That realization, more than anything, made her decision clear. With a deep breath, she grabbed a notepad and pen from behind the counter and began writing, "Dear Mr. Freeman, thank you for your letter. Your response to what happened at my diner has given me a lot to think about. If you're still willing, I would like to invite you to Maple Creek Diner for a proper meal, this time as my guest. I would also love for you to meet Eliza Reynolds, as you requested. If you're available this Friday after closing, I would be honored to have you here, not as a news story, but as someone who deserves a seat at my table. Sincerely, Melissa Hargrove." She read the letter over twice, then folded it neatly into an envelope. The next morning, she would find a way to get it to him. It wasn't just an invitation. It was a step towards something better. As Morgan Freeman stepped into Maple Creek Diner that evening, the atmosphere felt different from the last time he had been there. The lights were dimmer, the usual hum of a crowded restaurant replaced by the soft clinking of dishes being arranged for a private dinner. Melissa greeted him at the door with a small nod, polite but still cautious, before leading him to a booth near the back. Waiting there was Eliza Reynolds, her frail but dignified figure sitting upright, a neatly bound photo album resting in her lap. Talia stood nearby, watching her grandmother with quiet anticipation, knowing that what was about to unfold was bigger than just a meal. Morgan approached the table, offering his warmest smile. "Mrs. Reynolds, it's an honor." Eliza looked up, studying him for a long moment before nodding approvingly. "Call me Eliza," she said, her voice steady but laced with nostalgia. "And you? Well, you've got Beverly's eyes." At the mention of his grandmother's name, Morgan felt a stir in his chest. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, watching as she carefully placed a wrinkled hand over the cover of the photo album. "You knew her well?" he asked, his voice softer now. Eliza exhaled, running her fingers over the edges of the old album before opening it. The first page revealed a black and white photograph of two teenage girls sitting on a wooden porch, laughing, their arms slung around each other's shoulders. One of them, young, wild-haired, with eyes full of fire, was unmistakably his grandmother, Beverly Freeman. The other, thinner, more reserved, but equally determined, was Eliza. Morgan stared at the picture for a long moment, his breath catching slightly. "She never talked much about her childhood," he admitted, his fingers hovering over the photo. "I always knew she had a tough life growing up, but I never saw her like this." Eliza's lips curled into a knowing smile. "That's because she was too busy looking forward. Beverly never liked dwelling on the past, but I remember it all." She turned the page, revealing another photo. This one of the two of them, barefoot, standing near a river, their clothes soaked, their grins mischievous. "This was the summer we were 14. We spent every afternoon sneaking off to that riverbank, no matter how many times our parents told us to stay out of trouble. Beverly was the braver one, always the first to jump in, always daring me to follow." Her voice softened. "She never let me feel alone." Morgan's throat tightened as he listened, his mind conjuring images of the grandmother he had known. Strong, unyielding, fierce in her love for him. It was strange to think of her as a child, laughing, carefree, full of dreams. "She was like that until the very end," he murmured, tough as nails, but with a heart bigger than anyone realized. Eliza nodded. "That sounds like the Beverly I knew." She hesitated before flipping to another page. This time the photo was different. It was a letter, carefully preserved, written in faded ink. "This," Eliza said, "is the last letter she ever sent me. I never wrote back. I moved away, life got in the way. But I kept it." Morgan leaned in, scanning the delicate handwriting. It was addressed to Eliza Reynolds, dated nearly 5 decades ago. His eyes moved over the words, absorbing them as his grandmother's voice echoed in his mind. "Life is hard, but we make do. I don't know where the road will take me, but I hope we find each other again someday, because some friendships never fade, no matter how many miles stretch between us." Morgan swallowed hard, his fingers grazing the edges of the paper. He had spent his life admiring his grandmother, learning from her resilience, carrying her lessons with him. But now, sitting across from Eliza, hearing the stories of a young girl who had once been just a friend, he realized how much of her life he had never known. "She never forgot you," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "She carried you with her." Eliza blinked back the tears welling in her eyes and nodded. "And I carried her too." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of history settling between them. The photo album, the letter, the memories, they were all pieces of something bigger, something that had connected them long before this night. Morgan exhaled, then reached across the table, gently covering Eliza's hand with his own. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but full of meaning, "for keeping her alive in your memories and for sharing them with me." Eliza squeezed his hand in return. "Some people are worth remembering." And with that, a bridge was built, one that had taken decades to form, but had finally, against all odds, found its way back home. As the plates were cleared and the last bites of dessert lingered on the table, Morgan Freeman and Eliza Reynolds sat facing each other, the space between them no longer filled with just photographs and memories, but with something deeper. Understanding. The conversation had started with stories of the past, of Beverly's wild spirit and Eliza's cautious loyalty, but now it had shifted into something more personal. The air between them carried the weight of a shared history, not just through their connection to Beverly, but through the trials life had put before them. Morgan leaned back slightly, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "You know," he said, his deep voice thoughtful, "when I was young, I thought hardship was something you just endured, that if you could just get through it, survive it, then one day you'd come out on the other side untouched." He let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "But life doesn't work that way. It changes you, molds you into something different." Eliza nodded slowly, her aged hands folded on the table. "It does," she agreed. "And it never stops testing you. You get through one storm, and another comes right after." She tilted her head, her sharp eyes meeting his. "But tell me, Morgan, when did you realize surviving wasn't enough?" Morgan exhaled, tapping his fingers lightly against the ceramic cup before answering. "I think it was when I started looking back and realizing that pain didn't just shape me, it shaped how I treated others. There were moments where I could have let bitterness take over, moments where I could have let the world make me hard. But then I thought about my grandmother, about the way she loved me even when life gave her nothing but reasons to be angry. She taught me that kindness isn't about being weak. It's about being strong enough to choose grace when the world expects you to choose resentment." Eliza smiled at that, a knowing glimmer in her eye. "Beverly was always that way, tough on the outside, but inside, soft as a peach." She paused, taking a slow sip of her tea before speaking again. "People think strength is about how much you can carry, how much you can endure, but real strength is in letting go of what weighs you down, in choosing not to carry bitterness when you don't have to." She glanced at Melissa, who was pretending not to eavesdrop from the counter. "Some people struggle with that more than others." Morgan followed her gaze, understanding the unspoken message. "I think we all do," he admitted. "It's easier to build walls than bridges. Easier to protect yourself than to risk understanding someone who sees the world differently." His gaze softened as he looked back at Eliza. "But the best people I've ever known, the strongest, were the ones who took the risk anyway." Eliza's smile deepened. "Then you must have known some good people." Morgan chuckled, nodding. "I have, and I think I just met another." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Eliza reached over, patting his hand gently. "Your grandmother would be proud of the man you became, Morgan." His throat tightened slightly, but he simply smiled. I hope so. In that moment there were no barriers between them, just two souls who had walked through life's storms, sharing the lessons they had learned along the way. As the evening stretched on, the conversation between Morgan Freeman and Eliza Reynolds moved beyond memories and hardships. It became something more profound, something that neither of them had anticipated. What had started as a simple meeting between two strangers bound by a forgotten friendship had become a bridge between past and present, a realization that the connections we make in life, no matter how distant or unspoken, never truly fade. For Eliza, the night brought a sense of closure she had never known she needed. She had spent decades carrying the weight of unanswered questions, wondering what had become of Beverly, whether her old friend had ever thought of her as much as she had thought of Beverly. And now, through Morgan, she had her answer. Beverly had carried her too, had remembered her, had kept a piece of their friendship alive, even when miles and years had stretched between them. Knowing this, hearing it spoken aloud, was like reclaiming a part of herself that she had thought was lost. For Morgan, the evening shifted something deep within him. He had always admired his grandmother, but hearing Eliza's stories, the reckless adventures of their youth, the fierce way Beverly had protected those she loved, made him see her in a new light. She had been more than just the tough, unwavering woman who had raised him. She had once been a girl full of dreams, a friend, a protector, a person shaped by relationships that had come long before him. It made him think about legacy, not in terms of fame or success, but in the way people leave pieces of themselves in others, how love and friendship ripple through time in ways we don't always see. Across the room, Melissa stood behind the counter, quietly absorbing every word. She had expected this dinner to be an obligation, a chance to clear the air and move on, but watching Morgan and Eliza connect, seeing the genuine emotion in their eyes, made something shift in her too. She had spent so much time believing that divisions were necessary, that keeping her distance from people she disagreed with was the safest choice. But tonight proved otherwise. Here were two people from entirely different worlds, different generations, yet their stories intertwined in ways that defied all logic. Maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong to believe that certain gaps could never be bridged. The other staff members, who had been pretending not to eavesdrop, were just as affected. Talia, especially, felt a quiet sense of awe. She had always known her grandmother was strong, but tonight she saw her as something even greater, a keeper of stories, a living connection to a past that still shaped the present. And as the night came to a close, as Morgan gently closed the old photo album and Eliza patted his hand one last time, everyone in the diner understood one thing. This was more than just a dinner. It was proof that no matter how much time passes, how different people may seem, the threads of connection remain, waiting for the right moment to be woven together once again. Morgan Freeman sat in the back seat of a black sedan as it glided through the quiet streets of Oakwood, the streetlights casting elongated shadows along the pavement. He had left Maple Creek Diner only an hour ago, but the conversation with Eliza Reynolds, the warmth of the evening, and the significance of that small-town restaurant still lingered in his mind. He unlocked his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for. Daniel Carter, a longtime friend and the director of a small business investment fund that specialized in revitalizing local economies. Without hesitation, Morgan pressed call. The phone rang twice before Daniel answered. "Morgan?" came the familiar voice on the other end, filled with its usual sharp attentiveness. "What's got you calling this late?" Morgan leaned back against the leather seat, gathering his thoughts. "I just had dinner at a place in Oakwood," he began, his voice steady but thoughtful. "A small diner, nothing flashy, no gimmicks, just real, honest food and a history worth preserving." He paused for a moment, picturing Melissa's cautious expression, the way she had struggled to navigate the sudden flood of customers after his social media post. "It's called Maple Creek Diner, and I think it's exactly the kind of business your fund should be looking at." There was a brief silence before Daniel chuckled. "A diner? You don't usually call me about diners, Morgan. What makes this one special?" Morgan exhaled, choosing his words carefully, because it's more than just a place to eat. It's a pillar of its community, a place that's been there for years, feeding generations of families. But here's the thing. The owner, Melissa Hargrove, she's been struggling, not because the food isn't good or because people don't love the place, but because she was afraid of growth. She didn't want her diner to lose what made it special, so she resisted change. But now, because of let's just call it an unexpected turn of events, her business is booming and she's overwhelmed. She needs help, Daniel, not just to survive, but to grow in a way that keeps her doors open for the people who've always relied on her. Daniel was silent for a moment, considering. All right, he said finally. Send me the details. We have a vetting process, you know that. We don't just throw money at any business that's struggling. I know, Morgan said with a small smile. That's why I'm calling you, because I believe this place is worth it. Within days, the investment fund had begun its evaluation. A team was sent to Oakwood, discreetly visiting Maple Creek Diner, to observe the business firsthand. They saw the overflow of customers, the staff working tirelessly to keep up, and the lines stretching out the door. Clear signs that the demand was there, but the infrastructure was lacking. The kitchen, while well-maintained, was outdated and inefficient for the volume of food being served. The small dining area meant customers were left waiting outside in the elements, with no real waiting space. Most importantly, they saw Melissa hard-working, proud but undeniably exhausted, stretched thin by a business that had outgrown her ability to manage it alone. The final step in the process was a meeting. Melissa sat across from two representatives from the fund, the paperwork laid out before her. She had been skeptical at first, wary of outside investors changing the heart of her diner, but as she listened to them explain their terms, how she would retain full ownership, how the investment would be used solely for kitchen renovations, seating expansion, and hiring more staff, and how it would create jobs in the community, she began to see that this wasn't just about keeping up with demand. This was about securing the future of the diner for years to come. By the end of the meeting, she looked down at the papers in front of her, took a deep breath, and signed. Maple Creek Diner wasn't just surviving anymore, it was about to thrive. And it all started with one man seeing not just a business, but a legacy worth protecting. Melissa sat at her usual spot behind the counter of Maple Creek Diner, but tonight the diner felt different. The air wasn't thick with the usual exhaustion she had carried for months. Instead, it was filled with something foreign but welcome. Possibility. The investment from the small business fund had officially been approved, and for the first time in years, she wasn't worrying about whether she could afford next month's expenses. The financial boost gave her options she had never dared to consider before. Renovations, expansion, better equipment, and more staff. All things she had once dismissed as impossible luxuries. But now she had the power to reshape the future of her business. The first change she made was addressing the biggest problem, the kitchen. Her current setup was designed for a small-town diner serving predictable crowds, not the flood of customers that had poured in after Morgan Freeman's viral post. The investment allowed her to replace aging appliances with industrial-grade equipment, install new stovetops, a second griddle, and an expanded prep station, which meant the kitchen could handle twice as many orders at once. No more overwhelmed cooks, no more scrambling for space, no more running out of food before lunchtime. For Hector and the kitchen crew, this was nothing short of a miracle. I might actually go home before midnight now, Hector joked when he saw the blueprints for the kitchen layout. Next was the dining space. The small, cramped seating arrangement had worked for years, but now people were waiting outside in rain, snow, and blistering heat just to get a table. Melissa had always been reluctant to expand, fearing it would ruin the charm of the diner, but with the empty storefront next door sitting unused, she saw an opportunity. With part of the investment, she secured the lease and began planning to knock down the wall and expand into the space, doubling the seating capacity while keeping the cozy, welcoming feel that had made the diner special in the first place. No more long waits, no more turning customers away. But perhaps the most meaningful change was hiring more staff, not just to keep up with the workload, but to give back to the community. She had always wanted to provide stable jobs, to create an environment where people could earn a living, support their families, and feel valued. With the extra funding, she could finally do that. She started by increasing wages for her existing team, ensuring Hector, Talia, Donnie, and the others had financial security. Then, she partnered with a local recovery program, offering jobs to people looking for a second chance. "A job can change a life," she had told the investors. "It changed mine. I want to do the same for others." As Melissa looked around the diner that evening, she realized something. This wasn't just about survival anymore. For the first time in years, she wasn't just fighting to keep the doors open. She was building something bigger, stronger, and more lasting. And this time, she wasn't doing it alone. The first morning after securing the investment, Melissa stood in the middle of Maple Creek Diner, taking in everything around her: the scuffed floors, the mismatched chairs, the outdated kitchen, humming with overwork appliances. For years, she had seen these imperfections as part of the diner's charm, a reflection of its history. But now, with a future she could finally shape, she saw them as obstacles to growth. And so, she got to work. The first step was renovation. Contractors arrived within a week, carefully measuring, planning, and strategizing how to knock down the wall that separated the diner from the empty storefront next door. The plan was ambitious: double the seating area, expand the kitchen, and add a proper waiting section. But for the first time, Melissa didn't let doubt creep in. She worked alongside them, making sure the changes stayed true to the spirit of Maple Creek Diner. She chose warm lighting, sturdy but comfortable chairs, and large windows to bring in natural light, ensuring that even with expansion, the place would still feel like home. Next came staffing. The recent surge in customers had stretched her existing team to the brink, and with even more tables coming, they needed reinforcements. Melissa reached out to the local job center and the community recovery program, looking for people in need of a fresh start. She hired 2 new cooks, 3 waitresses, and an assistant manager, ensuring that Hector, Talia, and Danny wouldn't have to carry the burden alone anymore. She personally trained each new hire, emphasizing the values that had made her diner special: kindness, hard work, and treating every customer like family. Adapting to the increased demand wasn't easy. Even with extra hands, the first few weeks were chaotic. New systems had to be put in place: an updated order management system, better kitchen workflow, and a smoother table rotation process to handle peak hours. There were missteps, orders that took too long, deliveries that ran behind. But Melissa refused to let the stress consume her. Instead of reacting with frustration, she adjusted, learning from every mistake, guiding her team through the growing pains. One evening, as she watched Talia expertly navigate the packed diner, Hector flipping burgers with ease in the newly expanded kitchen, and the sound of laughter filling the air, Melissa realized something. She had done it. Maple Creek Diner wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. And this was only the beginning. Melissa had always believed in standing her ground. For years, she had built Maple Creek Diner on the foundation of hard work, discipline, and a firm belief that she knew what was best for her business. But after her unexpected encounter with Morgan Freeman, something inside her had shifted. She had spent so much time seeing the world in terms of who was welcome and who wasn't, of who fit into her vision and who didn't, that she had forgotten the core of what a diner, her diner, was supposed to be. It wasn't just a place for food. It was a place for people. Since that night, she found herself listening more to her staff, to her customers, even to herself. She had always prided herself on running a tight ship, but she realized that sometimes control wasn't the answer. Understanding was. She started checking in with her employees in ways she never had before, asking them about their days, their struggles, their aspirations beyond the diner. She made an effort to greet every customer, regardless of who they were, with warmth rather than judgment, recognizing that a simple meal could mean more than just food on a plate. It could mean comfort, connection, or even redemption. The biggest shift, however, was in how she handled disagreements. Where before she would dig in her heels, now she found herself pausing, thinking, and responding with care rather than stubbornness. She stopped seeing people's differences as threats and instead as opportunities to learn, to grow, to understand. When a local reporter came back, still eager to get an exclusive on the Morgan Freeman incident, she didn't dismiss him outright. Instead, she calmly explained how the experience had changed her, how it had reminded her that a business should bring people together, not push them apart. Her employees noticed the difference. Talia, who had once been hesitant to speak up, now found that her ideas were welcomed, even encouraged. Hector, who had often kept his head down and focused only on cooking, now had a say in how the kitchen operated, helping to create a more efficient and enjoyable workspace. And the customers, both old regulars and new faces drawn in by the diner's newfound fame, felt the shift, sensing that Maple Creek Diner wasn't just a place to eat, it was a place to belong. One evening, as she locked up after a long but fulfilling day, Melissa paused at the door, looking back at her diner, now bustling, thriving, filled with laughter and conversation. She realized that the lesson Morgan had taught her wasn't just about him, it was about everyone, about how kindness wasn't just a virtue, but a choice. And for the first time in a long time, she knew that she was making the right one. Talia had always been someone who kept her head down and did her job. She wasn't the kind of person to challenge authority or question decisions, especially when it came to Maple Creek Diner, the place that had given her a steady paycheck and the flexibility to balance work and school. But after witnessing the entire ordeal with Morgan Freeman, from the moment Melissa turned him away to the night he sat across from her grandmother, something in her changed. She had always believed in treating people with respect, but this experience had taught her something even deeper: the power of kindness and the courage it takes to choose it. At first, when Melissa had refused to serve Morgan, Talia had felt powerless, trapped between her boss's authority and her own instincts telling her that it was wrong. She had seen the hurt in his eyes, the disappointment that lingered in his calm response, and yet she had stood there, silent. That night she had lain awake, replaying the scene in her mind, wondering if she should have spoken up, if she could have changed the course of what happened. But what stuck with her most wasn't just the rejection, it was Morgan's response to it. He could have lashed out, could have used his influence to ruin Maple Creek Diner, but instead he chose grace. He chose kindness, and that choice didn't just change Melissa. It changed Talia too. She began to see the weight of small actions, how a single decision, whether to welcome someone or turn them away, to speak up or stay silent, could set off a ripple effect. She started paying closer attention to how people were treated, not just in the diner but in everyday life. She noticed how the elderly regulars sometimes sat alone in silence, and instead of just taking their orders, she engaged them in conversation. She noticed how new hires struggled to find their rhythm, and rather than just watching, she helped guide them through their shifts. She made an effort to learn people's names, to remember their orders, to make them feel seen. One afternoon, as she was refilling a customer's coffee, an older woman paused before taking her cup and said, "You know, it's nice to see a place where people actually care about each other." Talia smiled, realizing that this wasn't just about being a good waitress, it was about creating moments of kindness, about making people feel valued. Her biggest takeaway, however, came from watching her grandmother Eliza and the way she had embraced the connection with Morgan Freeman. Eliza had always told her, everyone has a story, even the people you don't understand. Seeing her grandmother and Morgan talk, share memories, and build an unexpected bond taught Talia that people were more connected than they seemed. It made her think about how quick people were to judge, not just Melissa, but herself as well. She realized that understanding someone doesn't mean you have to agree with them, it just means you have to be willing to listen. As the weeks passed, Talia found herself carrying these lessons with her, not just at work but in her daily life. She stopped assuming the worst about people. She started giving people the benefit of the doubt. She learned that real kindness isn't just about smiling or being polite. It's about choosing to see people as more than their opinions, their mistakes, or their differences. One evening, as she was closing up the diner, Melissa caught her at the door. "You know," Melissa said, leaning against the counter, "I think you've always known what this place was supposed to be. I'm just sorry it took me so long to catch up." Talia smiled, feeling a warmth settle in her chest. She had changed, and so had Maple Creek Diner. And all because one person chose to respond to rejection with kindness instead of resentment. The impact of the Maple Creek Diner story rippled through the small town of Oakwood in ways no one had anticipated. At first, people had been divided. Some had sided with Melissa's initial decision, believing that a business owner had the right to refuse service based on personal beliefs, while others were appalled that someone as respected as Morgan Freeman had been turned away. But as the full story unfolded, As the town watched Melissa's transformation, Morgan's kindness, and the unexpected connection between Eliza Reynolds and Beverly Freeman, perspectives began to shift. People who had once viewed the world in rigid black-and-white terms found themselves questioning their own biases. Conversations in local coffee shops and barbershops turned from gossip to discussions about what it truly meant to listen, to understand, and to forgive. The idea that kindness was not a weakness but a choice, a strength, became a message that resonated throughout the community. Parents used the story as a lesson for their children, explaining how one man's refusal to be bitter had led to something far more powerful than outrage: change. Business owners took note as well. Some who had once been wary of serving certain customers began rethinking their own policies, realizing that a business is more than just a transaction, it's a place where people connect. Regulars at the diner, who had once taken it for granted, now saw it with fresh eyes, not just as a place for meals, but as a symbol of what happens when people choose to grow rather than hold on to resentment. In the end, the story of Maple Creek Diner became more than just about one incident. It became a reminder that small acts of grace can transform entire communities, that bridges are built not through division, but through understanding and the willingness to change. The transformation of Maple Creek Diner was only the beginning. After the Small Business Investment Fund approved its support for the diner, Morgan Freeman didn't stop there. Recognizing the potential in the town of Oakwood, he spoke with Daniel Carter, the director of the fund, about other struggling businesses that could benefit from financial assistance. What started as a single investment in a diner quickly grew into a revitalization effort that touched nearly every part of the town's economy. Within months, multiple small businesses in Oakwood received funding, allowing them to modernize, expand, and create new job opportunities. One of the first businesses to benefit was Henderson's Hardware, a family-run store that had been struggling to compete with big-box retailers. With the funding, the owners were able to renovate their storefront, update their inventory system, and launch an online ordering service, making it easier for locals to support them rather than driving to the nearest city for supply. The investment not only kept the store open, but brought back lost customers and created jobs for 2 additional employees. The old movie theater, which had been shut down for years, also caught the fund's attention. Once a hub for the community, the theater had fallen into disrepair, its marquee dark, its seats covered in dust. With the funding, renovations began: new projection equipment, fresh seats, and a refurbished concession stand. By the time the theater reopened, it wasn't just a place to watch movies. It had become a gathering spot for the community again, hosting film nights, local performances, and even town hall meetings. The reopening created more than a dozen new jobs, and suddenly, Friday nights in Oakwood had new energy. Another major success story came from Lillian's Bakery, a beloved shop that had been on the verge of closing. Lillian, a third-generation baker, had struggled to keep up with rising costs and had nearly lost her lease. But with the investment, she was able to upgrade her kitchen, hire more staff, and even open a second location in a nearby town. What had once been a small, barely surviving bakery turned into a thriving enterprise, drawing customers from beyond Oakwood and boosting the town's reputation as a food destination. As these businesses grew, so did the local economy. More jobs meant more money staying within the community, and soon, people who had once considered leaving Oakwood for better opportunities found reasons to stay. Property values rose, new families moved in, and even the town's public spaces began to improve as tax revenue increased. What had once been a sleepy town, slowly fading like so many others across the country, was now experiencing a revival. Perhaps the most remarkable change was the sense of optimism that spread through Oakwood. People who had once believed their town was destined for decline now saw a future filled with potential. The story of Maple Creek Diner had started as a single moment of tension, but it had led to something far greater. A realization that, with the right support and the right mindset, even the smallest places could thrive. And at the heart of it all was the simple yet powerful truth that one act of kindness, one decision to choose understanding over division, could change not just a business, but an entire town. As Oakwood underwent its transformation, something even more profound took root. a renewed sense of community that hadn't been felt in years. The story of Maple Creek Diner had started as a moment of division, but in the months that followed, it became a lesson in forgiveness, growth, and the power of second chances. The town's residents, once accustomed to keeping to themselves, began looking out for one another in ways they hadn't before. Where people had once rushed past their neighbors with polite but distant nods, they now stopped to chat, to ask how business was going, to see if help was needed. The realization that a town's strength comes from the support of its people had settled into the hearts of many. Small businesses, rather than competing in silence, started to collaborate. Lillian's Bakery struck a deal with Henderson's Hardware, supplying fresh pastries for the store's early morning customers. The newly reopened movie theater partnered with local restaurants for dinner and a movie specials, ensuring that both businesses thrived together. Even Maple Creek Diner, once the center of controversy, became a symbol of transformation, hosting community nights where anyone, regardless of their background, was welcomed with open arms. The diner that had once turned someone away was now dedicated to bringing people together. But the most noticeable change wasn't in businesses. It was in how people treated each other. Acts of kindness, once rare, became the norm. Families struggling with bills found anonymous envelopes of help in their mailboxes. Elderly neighbors, once overlooked, now had people offering to shovel their driveways in the winter or carry their groceries in the summer. Schools saw increased parent involvement, and community projects flourished as people volunteered their time to make Oakwood a better place. Most importantly, the town had learned that kindness wasn't weakness, it was strength. The story of Morgan Freeman's rejection and his choice to respond with grace had left a lasting impression, showing that one small act of goodwill could ripple outward, changing lives in ways no one could predict. In the end, Oakwood didn't just rebuild its businesses, it rebuilt itself, stronger, more united, and more aware than ever of the simple truth that treating people with kindness is the most powerful change of all. Years after the events at Maple Creek Diner, the town of Oakwood still carried the mark of its transformation. What had begun as a moment of tension had become a lasting movement toward kindness, understanding, and growth. The businesses that had received investments continued to thrive, creating new jobs, attracting visitors, and giving locals reasons to stay. The once abandoned storefronts were now filled with cafes, artisan shops, and small family-owned businesses, each contributing to the town's newfound energy. The movie theater had become a cultural hub, hosting community events and film festivals, while Lillian's Bakery expanded into catering, hiring more local workers. Henderson's Hardware became the go-to place for both supplies and neighborly advice, proving that small businesses, when supported, could compete with corporate chains. But beyond economic success, the real change was in the people. Generosity became second nature, and the town's sense of division and suspicion had faded. Schools taught students about the power of kindness, using Morgan Freeman's story as an example of how choosing grace over resentment could change lives. The townspeople no longer waited for moments of crisis to come together. They did so every day, proving that the biggest changes often start with the simplest of choices, to treat others with respect even when it's difficult. Oakwood had not just survived, it had become a place where kindness was the foundation of everything. The story of Morgan Freeman and Maple Creek Diner is proof that one act of kindness can ripple outward in ways no one could ever predict. When Morgan was turned away from the diner that night, he had every reason to respond with anger, to call for boycotts, or to use his influence to damage the business. But instead, he chose grace. He didn't retaliate, he uplifted. His simple decision to speak positively about the diner despite being rejected sparked a chain of events that changed not only the restaurant, but the entire town of Oakwood. What started as a moment of division led to reflection, growth, and reconciliation, showing that kindness isn't just about how we treat people when things are easy, it's about how we respond when we are hurt. Melissa, once firm in her beliefs, learned the power of understanding, realizing that her fear of change had blinded her to the very purpose of her diner, to bring people together. Talia discovered that standing up for kindness is just as important as practicing it, and the people of Oakwood saw firsthand how forgiveness and open-mindedness can strengthen a community. Because of one decision made with kindness, a struggling diner received the help it needed. Small businesses across town got the support to thrive, and an entire community became more united, more compassionate, and more willing to see the humanity in each other. The lesson in all of this is simple yet profound. Acts of kindness are not just moments, they are movements. They spread, they inspire, and they change people in ways they never expect. It is easy to respond to negativity with more negativity, to meet rejection with resentment. But true strength comes in choosing to break the cycle, to see the bigger picture, and to lead with understanding instead of anger. Morgan Freeman's story at Maple Creek Diner serves as a timeless reminder that when we choose kindness, we don't just change a single moment, we change lives, entire communities, and sometimes even the world. The story of Morgan Freeman and Maple Creek Diner is more than just an account of a business turning around or a town experiencing economic growth. It is a testament to the power of human connection. It proves that despite our differences, despite our backgrounds, and despite the barriers we often build around ourselves, we are more alike than we are different. At its core, this story was never about a single act of rejection or even about a single act of kindness. It was about the bridges that can be built when people choose to understand one another instead of pushing each other away. When Melissa first refused to serve Morgan Freeman, it was not just a business decision. It was a moment of division, a reflection of the deep lines that often separate people based on assumptions, fears, and personal biases. But what followed was something remarkable. Instead of deepening that division, Morgan chose to extend a hand rather than raise a fist. His willingness to respond not with anger, but with kindness, opened the door for something much greater. A chance for healing, for learning, and for growth. It wasn't just about him or about the diner. It was about showing that people, no matter how different they seem, can still find common ground. This idea of connection and unity became even clearer when Eliza Reynolds and Morgan Freeman discovered their unexpected link through his grandmother, Beverly. Two people, separated by time and distance, were brought together by history, by shared experiences, and by the realization that the past has a way of guiding us toward the people we are meant to reconnect with. Their conversation was not just about remembering old times, it was about acknowledging that relationships, even those we think have faded, can still shape who we become. It was about the threads that quietly tie us together, even when we don't see them at first. But perhaps the most important lesson from this entire event is that connection is a choice. It would have been easy for Melissa to hold on to her pride, for Morgan to walk away with resentment, for the town to ignore the lessons unfolding before them. Instead, people chose to listen, to reflect, and to reach across divides. They chose to support one another, to see their community not as separate individuals but as a collective, bound by the simple yet powerful idea that kindness and understanding are stronger than any disagreement. The town of Oakwood changed, not just because of financial investment, but because people learned to see each other differently, to recognize that true strength lies in unity, not in isolation. This story serves as a reminder that in a world often divided by beliefs, by backgrounds, by past wounds, the only way forward is through empathy, conversation, and the willingness to truly see one another. The barriers we place between ourselves and others are rarely as immovable as they seem. All it takes is one act of understanding, one gesture of goodwill, to begin tearing those walls down. Because in the end, what matters most is not how we differ, but how we come together despite those differences. That is the true power of connection. The story of Morgan Freeman and Maple Creek Diner is more than just an inspiring tale. It's a call to action for all of us. It reminds us that kindness is a choice, one we can make every single day in ways both big and small. You don't have to be famous or have influence to create change. Sometimes, the smallest acts of goodwill can have the greatest impact. A kind word to a stranger, a helping hand to someone in need, a willingness to listen instead of judge. These are the simple things that can transform not just individuals, but entire communities. We often think that making a difference requires grand gestures, but in reality, it starts with the way we treat each other in our everyday lives. Imagine if, instead of reacting to negativity with more negativity, we responded with understanding. Imagine if we took the time to truly see and hear the people around us, to recognize their struggles, their hopes, their humanity. The story of Oakwood and Maple Creek Diner proves that one act of kindness can ripple outward, touching lives in ways we may never even see. So today, ask yourself, how can I bring more kindness into the world? Whether it's reaching out to a neighbor, supporting a local business, or simply choosing patience in a moment of frustration, every small action matters. The change starts with you. The story of Morgan Freeman and Maple Creek Diner carries a lesson that resonates deeply, especially for those who have witnessed the ebbs and flows of life over many years. It is a reminder that no matter our age or experiences, kindness, understanding, and second chances remain some of the most powerful forces in the world. Too often, as we grow older, we become set in our ways, holding on to past experiences, grievances, or assumptions about people and situations. But this story teaches us that it is never too late to change, to learn, and to open our hearts to new perspectives. One of the most profound lessons from this story is that kindness is not a weakness, it is a choice and a strength. Morgan Freeman had every reason to react with anger when he was turned away, yet he chose to respond with grace. Instead of lashing out, he uplifted the very business that had rejected him, and in doing so, he transformed not just a diner, but an entire town. This is a powerful example for all of us. When we meet hostility with kindness, we do not just ease tension, we create the possibility for something greater to emerge. For those who have lived long lives, we have seen moments where bridges could have been built, but were instead torn down by pride, fear, or misunderstanding. But this story shows us that understanding is always possible, even when it seems unlikely. Melissa, who initially believed she was making the right choice by refusing service, later realized that her fears had clouded her judgment. She learned that true leadership is not about standing firm in division, but about knowing when to grow, when to listen, and when to change. This is a lesson that applies not just to business owners, but to anyone navigating relationships with family, friends, and neighbors. Another important message is that we are all more connected than we realize. The discovery that Eliza Reynolds and Beverly Freeman had been childhood friends was a testament to the idea that the past has a way of bringing people together in unexpected ways. Many of us carry memories of friends we have lost touch with, of relationships that faded over time, but those bonds never truly disappear. Whether through a shared history, a small act of kindness, or a simple conversation, we can rebuild connections and rediscover the people who shaped us. Perhaps the most valuable lesson for older generations is that change is always possible, no matter how late in life it comes. Melissa had run her diner a certain way for years, believing she knew what was best. But when she opened her heart to a different perspective, she found new opportunities, new friendships, and a renewed sense of purpose. It is a reminder that we too can continue to evolve. It is never too late to soften our hearts, to see the world with new eyes, and to be part of something bigger than ourselves. Finally, this story teaches us that the smallest acts of kindness can create waves of change. A kind word, a listening ear, a moment of patience. These things might seem small, but they can set off a chain reaction that touches countless lives. In our communities, in our families, and in our daily lives, we have the power to make a difference simply by choosing kindness over bitterness, understanding over division, and generosity over self-interest. So, as we reflect on this story, let us ask ourselves, how can we bring more kindness into the world? How can we mend old divisions, reconnect with those we have lost, and be a source of light in someone else's life? Because if there is one truth that stands the test of time, it is this: the more kindness we give, the more we receive in return.